Hello listener, the Nameless Scholar here, and today we will be looking at the rise of the Death Guard Legion. The Death Guard is the legion whose name is a byword for resilience and unshakable courage, whose warriors serve to protect humanity against itself and its own corruption on more than 100 worlds, and at whose hands scores of Xenos races have met their destruction. The Death Guard have continuously fought tirelessly against this most vile of threats, inhuman, unrecognizable, and soulless monsters of the dark, the very stuff of nightmares. Of all the worlds upon which the Primarchs were scattered, few were as terrible or forlorn a place as damned Barbarous. What consistent information can be gleaned of the Death Guard Primarch story have a single source: the so-called Stygian Scrolls of Lachlan Thor, a historian attached to the Crusade fleet that breached the dark nebula that surrounded Barbarous. Though a polymath of great intellect, his vision was often a morbid one, and his works unsettled as much as they illuminated. On Barbarous, he recorded the story of Mortarion for posterity, and his resultant works, the Stygian Scrolls, became part of the Death Guard's culture, a copy of which is presented to each Space Marine of the Legion upon their formal investiture into its ranks. When 20 nascent Primarchs of the Space Marine Legions were scattered across the galaxy in a mysterious accident, the Stygian Scrolls tell of one that came to rest upon the planet Barbarous. This isolated world, located in the southern border of the Segmentum Tempestus, was a world divided. The population was split into two groups: noble beings, a technologically advanced humanoid race with fantastic powers that lived high in the mountains, and the settlers, regular baseline humans who had been trapped on the planet millennia earlier and were forced to eke out a pitiful existence in the poisonous valleys of the planet. Over time, they had adapted to the poisonous fog that enveloped the mountains, but had developed into a distinct branch of humanity with only a medieval level of technology. The noble people of the mountains were immune to this poisonous atmosphere, living high up in the mountains in massive fortresses, safe from the pitiful creatures that lurked below. Mortarion's gestation capsule fell upon the planet Barbarous and came to rest on a bleak moor, strewn with a heap of decomposing corpses left in the wake of a recent battle. Here, some lowland dwellers, looking for scraps, found a mewling infant, screaming and wailing where a normal child would have already suffocated and died long before. Interested in the strange, pale creature, the lowlanders took the infant with them. They named him Mortarion, Child of Death, as he had been found amongst the dead in a realm of death. The newfound infant was brought to one of the larger scrap towns, large ramshackle towns made of salvaged scrap and metal, where thousands of souls were trapped in a nightmarish world. They eked out a peasant's existence by day beneath a dim sun which never burned completely through the unblinking gloom of the planet's putrid atmosphere, unable to see the multitude of stars that shone brightly above their world's orbit. Only the strongest managed to endure this bleak existence. It was here that the young Primarch rapidly grew to adolescence, and then just as quickly to full adulthood. The people of Barbarous barely tolerated the pale, gaunt youth, but reluctantly let him live amongst them, as he had a strong back and possessed strength that was amazingly robust, which made him ideal for harvesting their meager crops. Mortarion wielded a massive harvesting scythe when performing his farming duties, though he worked many long hours in the fields, harvesting 10 times the crops of any one person. his efforts were underappreciated and unremarked upon. This did not bother Mortarion, who found the labor of a welcome escape from the boredom of the tedium of his existence on forlorn Barbarous, and so this went on for a number of years, until one day a lord and his personal guard happened upon the Primarch's dilapidated town. When the strangers approached the frightened townsfolk, all of them fled and hid themselves in the nearby woods. Only Mortarion remained in the field in which they were working. He stood tall and proud, massive scythe in hand. The lord was intrigued by the pale, gaunt, but obviously well-muscled young man, and sent out his best warrior to test him. Mortarion easily bested the warrior. Impressed, the lord invited the young man to join him at his palace in the mountains. Though cautious, Mortarion eagerly followed the lord and his entourage high into the peaks of their world's mountains, testing the limits of the young man's endurance. The lord determined precisely how high into the purified, thin atmosphere he could endure. Mortarion was then brought to the nearest stony keep. Here, the young Primarch was granted refuge from the bleak existence of the poisonous valleys below, and offered to be educated in the various sciences and other mysteries of the wider universe. He readily found himself at home amongst the noble Highlanders. He no longer had to live amongst cowards, thieves, and scrap hunters, and he found that he also had some tolerance towards the purified atmosphere due to his superhuman, resilient body. He could not climb to the highest castles where the air was too pure and thin for even his mighty lungs, but most others were reachable. Mortarion's body had adapted to the poisonous environments located in the dismal valleys far below, and found it difficult to breathe without the use of a breathing apparatus that contained some of the deadly poisonous mist of his first home. The lord and Mortarion quickly became fast friends, and the lord taught him all he knew of warfare and leadership, and of how the peasants in the valley needed to be controlled and constantly thinned out, otherwise they would overpopulate, and their ecosystem would collapse. As a technologically advanced people, many of the nobles of Barbarous were skilled in the areas of science and all things technological. They were even familiar with certain mysteries of cybermancy, such as the true rites of cybernetic resurrection from death, proscribed as nightmare sciences of the dark age of technology. Since they always had ample bodies to experiment with, the nobles became master flesh crafters and cybermancers, perfecting the arts of gene forging and cybermancy over several millennia, which enabled them to resurrect themselves in body time and time again, as they continuously attempted to reach a true personification of a single ideal archetype. Mortarion very much agreed with the lord on the principles of humans needing guidance and protection from themselves, and also picked up the arts of flesh crafting and cybermancy. Eventually, the Emperor of Mankind detected the presence of one of his lost sons, and so he ordered his expeditionary fleet to make for the Segmentum Tempestus. Here, they found the bleak and fog-shrouded world of Barbarous, the Emperor and an entourage of the Legio Custodes, and a large imperial delegation were transported to the largest castle located on the planet's highest peak. Here, the Emperor was greeted by the noble lord of Barbarous and his planet's representatives. When the Emperor finally saw his lost son standing amongst the lord's entourage, he made his way towards him. He met with Mortarion without the dissembling that he had been needed with those Primarchs that he had found of more savage timber. Mortarion immediately recognized the Emperor as his true father, and immediately swore fealty to the master of mankind. Mortarion recognized in the Emperor a kindred spirit. His father possessed a keen, powerful intelligence and regal bearing, a perfect noble leader. He too believed that humanity was weak and needed to be shepherded into a new age of enlightenment and prosperity. But this could only be done by separating the wheat from the chaff, those who accepted the imperial truth and those who did not. In short order, the Emperor immediately granted Mortarion command of the Dusk Raiders, the 14th Legion of the Legio Astartes. The Primarch needed little in the aid of assimilation of knowledge of the wider galaxy. The Great Crusade and the many technological wonders of the newborn Imperium of mankind. A skilled warlord in his own right, Mortarion began to imprint his own image upon his legion, gathering the Terran-born warriors that possessed his genetic lineage before in a great assemblage, the grim and spectral figure, robed and bearing the great black scythe that had been gifted to him by the Emperor himself. It seemed to the Terran-born Dusk Raiders that an ancient, graven image of the Grim Reaper had come before them as their new master. In a hushed whisper, the Primarch claimed ownership over the 14th Legion. Thus, by this simple decree, the Dusk Raiders were no more, and the records and annals from that day forward would carry this new name as once to strike fear into the hearts of mankind's enemies. The Libram Primaris, or Book of Primarchs, tells how Mortarion brought the relentlessness, remorselessness, and resilience to the Legion, built of his own genetic material. The resulting prowess of the Death Guard was recognized from the moment Mortarion took command. But the young Primarch never settled in Imperial society outside of battle. Though grim, Mortarion was driven, fixated on reckoning with those who would dare oppress the worlds where mankind resided. Mortarion felt at home, taking part in his father's endeavor of the Great Crusade. This was his purpose all along, conquering human colonies, purging Xenos, and killing nightmarish monsters. The 14th Legion fought tirelessly in the service of the Great Crusade, never relenting in battle beneath their Genesire's gaze, pursuing the liberation of mankind with a fervor the Great Crusade had never known. Mortarion's gene seed made his sons hardy through his swiftly imposed regimens of toxin hardening and extreme environment tampering. The former Dusk Raiders became more durable than ever. Often the Death Guard were utilized as a primary tool to deploy to the harshest war zones and against the most resilient warp-touched forces. Over time, Mortarion shaped the creed and practices of the Death Guard, his beliefs in many ways forming a natural extension of their own. Beliefs and doctrine becoming ever more refined and extreme. During his time, Mortarion became close to his brother Horus, Primarch of the Luna Wolves Legion, a superlative leader and master strategist. When the two legions fought alongside one another, Horus used his legion in coordination with Mortarion's. Mortarion would use his Death Guard to draw out the enemy and wear them down, and the Luna Wolves would strike. Caught between the hammer and anvil of both legions, enemies were utterly decimated by this deadly combination. This combat tactic worked brilliantly, and Mortarion grew close to Horus. At the time of their reunification with Mortarion on Barbarous, The 14th Legion were primarily composed of Terran-born legionnaires. But as the Great Crusade progressed and the Death Guard brought several worlds into Imperial compliance, inevitably they sustained heavy casualties, as the Death Guard preferred to fight in the toughest, most hazardous environments, known as Zone Mortalis operations. This took an extensive toll on the Death Guard's numbers. Mortarian's hand and mind was at work everywhere, remaking his legion, from changing tactical doctrines to equipment procurement and, some say, behind the selection of candidates and changing practices in the legion's apothecarium, where he gained the latter knowledge to interfere. When a large number of legionnaires fell, Mortarion was forced to send additional Astartes from Barbarus, though he would have liked to have filled his legion with the noble-born Barbarans, for indeed they made for consummate leaders and excellent officers. They were far too few in number to make up the bulk of the 14th Legion. Therefore, though initially reluctant to do so, Mortarion was eventually forced to recruit the scurvy-looking humans that resided in the toxic valleys of his homeworld. With new recruitment at issue, Barbarus itself in a short span of years became little more than a factory of sorts to produce new recruits for the Death Guard Legion, an intake from other sources of recruitment to which the Legion had dwindled to a mere handful. Unless the pressure of fatalities in the field proved too great, Mortarion's resistance to use the bloodstock other than that of Barbarus wavered only because of the need to keep his legion's strength battle worthy in his eyes. Recruitment solely from Barbarus was, however, aided by the high suitability of the planet's hardy feral population to the conversion process. The Legion's gene seed seemed to amplify the uncommonly resistance to contagion and toxins in its barbarous candidates to unheard of levels. Only the youngest and strongest took full or partial conversion into the Legiones Astartes. Heedless of the high fatality rate that late induction carried with it, deemed a small enough price to pay to continue in the service of Mortarion, their savior. As fresh intakes of the new Space Marines came in from Barbarus, the surviving core of Terran blood became a minority as the Great Crusade burned on across the stars. The Death Guard at the forefront of the fighting in the most hellish war zones imaginable. As time went on, fresh legionnaires raised from Barbarus stock began to fill up more and more ranks of the Legion until they made up more than half the Legion's numbers. This divide in the Legion made for strenuous times. The humans of Barbarus were unable to fully let go of their habits of thieving, backstabbing, infighting, and excessive use of violence, and officers had a hard time controlling the line formations of their barbarous brethren. Though they embodied the Death Guard's typical merciless nature and unforgiving ways, they exhibited little of the control they later possessed. As a consequence, the Legion employed a far larger number of disciplinary troops than almost any other Legion, barring perhaps the 6th and the 7th Legions. The disciplinary corps served to maintain the ranks, both during and away from battle, as well as curb any attempts to disregard or circumvent orders. The Consul Opescuari were selected from amongst the ranks of noble-born Barbarans of the 14th Legion, and granted the power of life and death over their brothers. Upon their right shoulder pauldrons, they were marked by the distinctive Shanghauta emblem of that oft-maligned order. Mortarion saw that his Barbaran sons would never rise to be more than what they were, so he made sure they never rose to positions beyond that of a simple line legionary. In battle, the disciplinary officers would ensure that when the Death Guard deployed on a campaign, that a simple operation did not devolve into an uncontrolled killing spree. Those legionnaires that slaughtered without recourse or care or threatened the preservation of the vital infrastructure or industrial capacity of a non-compliant world that was to be brought into the imperial fold, were subjected to the harshest of penalties. Often, it was only through the brutal efforts of the disciplinary corps that the preservation of such vital assets were brought at the cost of a number of summary executions. This brutal form of harsh discipline also changed the Death Guard strategy. The commanders of the Legion often deployed barbarian legionnaires, often judged to be fractious or unstable, in the initial assault waves of Zone Mortalis operations, often suffering the greatest losses. Such blatant disregard for their lives, of course, only increased the feelings of animosity already present within the Legion. Just before the Emperor was set to return to Terra, Horus, in supreme command of the Great Crusade, he called his Primarchs together to the planet of Nicaea. There he sought to address the increasingly acrimonious disputes that had broken out over the nature of psychic ability. Mortarion was one of the Primarchs present that took a stance against Psykers within the lengths of the Astartes legions. From his time on Barbarus, he had learned that psychic abilities were a powerful weapon, but with two edges, and he saw no man, not even his own brothers, being capable of wielding this weapon safely. There was no boundary between psychic abilities and the use of potentially destructive sorceries. Even used with great intention, the path to damnation was paved with such sentiments. It was all a matter of degrees, with one inevitably leading to the other. Mortarion knew full well of the corruption that rested in all men. This he made clear towards the council on Nicaea. As was his habit, his speech was short, precise and to the point, especially compared to almost mad ramblings of Leman Russ. Mortarion's viewpoints made greater impact on the Emperor and forced Magnus to justify his stance on the use of such abilities. The Emperor's decision to withhold knowledge about the nature of chaos had not stopped the Primarchs from sensing its dangers, and as Magnus had feared, some lashed out against Psykers, the eternal scapegoats. In the end, a compromise was reached between the Primarch of the Thousand Suns and the Master of Mankind, beginning with the Crimson King himself. The entirety of the 15th Legion were soul-bound to the Emperor. The Rite purged and protected the 15th Legion from the temptations of sorcery, and it was intended to be a palpable sign of their loyalty. Though this compromise pacified most, the judgments did nothing to assuage Mortarion, who silently departed the main audience chamber where the council was held. After leaving Nicaea, he immediately disbanded his legions librarius and ordered such witchcraft be suppressed. As the events of the Dornian Heresy unfolded, and the Death Guard were informed of the tragic events that had occurred on Istvan V, they were heavily engaged in putting down a system-wide rebellion in the Coronet Deeps within the Segmentum Obscurus. To make matters worse, they were cut off by the upsurge in heavy warp storm activity in the region. Fearing for his father's life, Mortarion was desperate to find a way to reach Terra in order to stand by the Emperor's side when the time came, and the arch-traitor Dorn and his traitor legions finally reached the throne world. Mortarion ordered his fleet to make several short warp jumps, though with each one he made, several ships would be lost in the roiling tides and unpredictable eddies of the turbulent Empyrean. As the Death Guard made slow but steady progress towards the throne world, their luck finally ran out. As the 14th Legion fleet exited the warp, they were set upon by a massive Eldar Corsair force. Caught unaware, They had no time to raise their recently deactivated void shields. The attack by the Corsair fleet was so sudden and overwhelming as hundreds of Eldar ships burst into reality at the same moment, bringing their weapons to bear and firing as one upon the Death Guard's nearest vessel. The doomed ship exploded spectacularly as the enemy salvo set off a chain reaction in the ship's plasma engines. Within the second of the death of the first ship, dozens of its sister ships followed suit, consumed by the deadly salvos of the Corsair ships. Initially, the Death Guard's fleet fragmented under the vicious assault. The Corsair pressed their assault as Mortarion attempted to rally his fleet and press a counterattack against the Marauders. The battle was hard-fought and deadly, but in the end, the Death Guard managed to drive off their attackers. The remaining ships that emerged from this deadly confrontation were half dead, their damaged armor peeling from their superstructure, their weapons spent. Though they had emerged victorious, it was a Pyrrhic victory at best, for the Eldar Corsairs had attacked where it hurt the Death Guard vessels the most, destroying many of the ship's warp engines and killing the majority of their navigators, effectively stranding them on the other side of the galaxy. Realizing that his legion faced a hopeless situation, Mortarion was demoralized and isolated himself within his personal chambers, ruminating upon his failure. The Pale King received counsel from his ever-faithful first captain Callus Typhon. Born of barbarian noble descent, Typhon was a superlative warrior and gifted strategist. He had earned the Primarch's implicit trust and friendship in the heat of hundreds of battles, rising in both position and esteem as one of Mortarion's favorite sons. In recognition of his loyal and dedicated service, Mortarion had named the first captain as Lord of Barbarous, the de facto regent and protector of their mutual homeworld. Possessing a calculating and shrewd mind, if anyone could find hope in a desperate situation, it would be Mortarion's closest confidant and friend. Typhon, the Pale King, highly valued his first captain's counsel and often heeded his friend's advice. It was in this moment, when his legion faced their darkest hour, that Typhon finally felt the courage to come clean to his Gene-Sire about his innate abilities. As he knew his Primarch's personal feelings on the use of psychic abilities, Typhon had been left with no other choice and kept his abilities hidden from everyone, including his Gene-Sire. But at this moment, now was not the time for such subterfuge, and so he reluctantly shared with Mortarion the knowledge about his gifts that reassured the Primarch that the warp gift he possessed would see them through their journey in the Empyrean safe enough. Though he hated the concept of relying on witchery, Mortarion was left with little choice. The Death Guard fleet may transition into the warp and hopefully make their way towards Terra. With his first captain's secrets revealed, Mortarion finally saw a light in the darkness, but traveling through the warp was a tricky proposition at best, and without a navigator to guide them through the turbulent tides of the Empyrean, it was a near suicidal prospect. This was, of course, a part of Dorn's plan all along, to lure Mortarion and his forces into the warp and offer them to the clutches of the Lord of Decay. The strange tides of the Empyrean were notoriously fickle, and during their voyage the Death Guard fleet became becalmed, as their ships lingered directionless and without hope. The cloying influence of Father Nurgle began to take hold. The corrupting influence of Nurgle infiltrated the vessels of the 14th Legion and began to spread through the ranks of the barbarous Scorn Legionnaires of the Death Guard, subjecting them to the terrible and virulent Destroyer Plague and Nurgle's rot. as the Death Guard vessels drifted through the warp. These virulent plagues transformed the barbarous legionnaires into bloated, corpulent, and disease-ridden mockeries of their former selves, causing them to rise up as Nurgle's pestilent servants, the first Plague Marines. Each of these legionnaires were now bloated grotesques covered in pockmarks and boils, scabs and sores. They bore the stink of corruption as the very air about them was clouded with swarming flies. Throughout the Death Guard fleet, these putrescent heretic legionnaires were resurrected by the malign influence of Nurgle and turned upon their former brethren. Firefights erupted as the loyalists fought a desperate battle against the seemingly undying traitor legionnaires. But Dorn did not take into account Mortarian's true strength as the Lord of Death and a master of ancient and forbidden sciences. In the Death Guard's darkest hour, while trapped deep within the tumultuous eddies of the Immaterium, which saw the Pale King fighting the horrors of Nurgle, Mortarian used the forbidden knowledge he had learned in his youth. The Primarch enacted the so-called Lazarus Protocols. Cyber Resurrection, one of the rites of cybermancy. The application of such forbidden technology was one of the nightmare sciences of the Dark Age of technology. Utilizing such forbidden rites, Mortarian was able to resurrect his fallen sons, who had only recently succumbed to the virulent plagues that had ravaged their transhuman bodies, making a mockery of their enhanced invulnerability to poisons and disease. With it, he was able to resurrect the fallen into a semblance of life. These so-called revenants, resurrected legionnaires, still retained their memories and were even capable of speech, though they were emblematic of that which had long been considered Malatek Incarna, the incarnation of heretical technology by the priests of Mars. Successful in his endeavors, Mortarian shared this forbidden knowledge with his legion's apothecaries and ordered them to enact the Lazarus Protocols on their vessels fallen. Complying with their genesire's orders, the apothecaries enacted the same forbidden rites and successfully raised the fallen legionnaires. Though they had been resurrected to a semblance of life, they were all but stripped of their independent will as well. These revenant legionnaires were now basically living suits of armor which still moved and functioned, and could respond to orders just like a sentient man, though now they were little more than automatons, utilizing his long-suppressed innate psychic abilities. Mortarian communicated telepathically with his resurrected sons and ordered them to attack the corrupted legionnaires. Soon firefights erupted on the vessels throughout the Death Guard fleet, as desperate battle ensued between the loyalists and traitor legionnaires. Moving in orderly formations, the Revenant legionnaires were remorseless, implacable, and nigh unstoppable. As they marched forward into battle, the noble-born barbarous officers quickly followed suit and joined their resurrected brothers in the fight against the corrupted kin. The Terran-born officers were at first horrified by their genesire's actions, as well as the appearance of their pestilent former brethren. But the Terrans were both pragmatic and intelligent enough to understand that oftentimes in the heat of battle, desperate times called for desperate measures. Putting aside their apprehension, they too quickly joined the fight against the traitors. Again, First Captain Typhon showed brilliant initiative and leadership as he constantly inspired his brothers by spearheading one of the primary counterattacks against the vile heretic legionnaires, as Mortarian directed the valiant defense of the Death Guard's flagship. As the desperate battle ensued, the Primarch telepathically communicated with his officers, reassuring and helping them to understand that the resurrection of their fallen brothers had been a tool of necessity to fight against the diseased rebel formations. Despite the War Master's diabolical plan to corrupt the entirety of the 14th Legion, miraculously, only one ship, the frigate Eisenstein, had fully succumbed to the corrupting influences of Nurgle. This was due to their commander battle, Captain Nathaniel Garrow, who had taken ill following an infection he had acquired after recently receiving a new cybernetic leg. This made the stricken Death Guard officer susceptible to the corrupting influence of the Plague God. The battle captain locked himself in his own quarters so as to not reveal his condition. But when the revolt came, he burst out of his private chamber, now wholly transformed into a demonic servant of Nurgle. The mortally wounded Garrow had finally lost his fight to Nurgle's wrath that ran rampant throughout his diseased and corpulent form, giving himself over fully to the offer of the Father Nurgle to end his pain. Garrow's body was possessed and metamorphosed into a demonic entity known as the Lord of Flies. The Lord of Flies proceeded to attack the ranks of the few surviving former fellow officers from their vulnerable flanks, ensuring victory after slaughtering the remaining loyalists. The Lord of Flies then ordered the Eisenstein to break formation and make a jump into the warp, disappearing to parts unknown. When the Death Guard finally exited the warp, their legion had been transformed. Although all the Legion's officers were fully alive, the majority of the rank-and-file Legionnaires had become undead, reanimated warriors, no longer living, but not alive either. Their power armor was modified by the Legion's tech marines to keep their bodies from decomposing. When not awake, they were kept within a cryogenic state at sub-life support temperatures until they were needed for battle. But over time, these revenants gradually became slower and slower the longer they spent away from their cryostasis chambers. Through the use of such forbidden techniques, repeated resurrection was possible even after a revenant was killed. Again, the Death Guard intended to keep their dark fate concealed from those outside their legion, a secret they would take their graves. Unfortunately, their troubles in the warp had delayed them from taking part in the Dornian Heresy's epic final campaign during the Battle of Terra. The Death Guard arrived just after the battle concluded, with the War Master and both Primarchs of the Night Lords and Sons of Horus dead. The Emperor himself had been mortally wounded and was later integrated within the psychic machinery of the Astronomicon, to be fed and nourished with 1,000 souls a day in order to sustain his wavering life force. Arriving on Terra, Mortarion met up with his brother Magnus the Red. Although he had spoken out against Magnus during the Council of Nicaea, Magnus greeted him with open arms. Magnus knew, as powerful the Psyker he was, what forbidden knowledge Mortarion had used in order to save his legion from damnation, and as Psyker to Psyker, there was no longer any differences between them. It was there, at the side of their fallen father, the brothers finally made peace with one another. In the meantime, Ezekiel Abaddon, first captain of the Sons of Horus Legion, took charge and reorganized and renamed his own legion to shun their past. Thus, the Black Templars were born, and just as the War Master had done before him, Abaddon proved supremely adept at manipulating the disparate parts of the shattered Imperium back to some semblance of order. Accepting the numerical weakness of the Legiones Astartes at the time, and the vast numbers of threats and enemies they faced, Abaddon made the Black Templars the core of an overwhelming force, composed of as many legions as possible. The idea was to prevent the legions becoming isolated, both so that they would not be destroyed piecemeal, and that they would watch over one another to prevent any further legions falling to the ruinous powers. Initially, there was resistance to such a cautious approach, especially from legions whose primarchs had survived. However, the tragic fate of the isolated Raven Guard and the grievous losses the Iron Warriors sustained trying to dislodge the Imperial fists from their iron cage reinforced the wisdom of Abaddon's proposals. Soon he was able to command the fealty of the surviving Primarchs and played on their individual preferences and prejudices. Mortarion committed to a force to drive the space wolves from Fenris proposed by Magnus, on the understanding that reciprocity would be observed when it came to mounting a genocidal crusade against the Eldar craftworld deemed responsible for the raid during the Heresy. Painfully slowly, but surely, the tide turned and the borders of Imperial control space rolled back once again. A combined force of Death Guard and Black Templars, under the dead eyes of Mortarion, was given the honor of reclaiming Chogoris, the feral legion homeworld of the traitorous White Scars, the patchwork brotherhood abandoned by the fallen Primarch Jagatai Khan, fought like wolves alongside the endless ties of tribal horsemen and Palatine infantry. Still heeding the words of the great Khan, none dared to question the righteousness of their cause. Their hearts were full of sorrow, for the coming of the enemy meant that Jagatai, and indeed the Emperor, had failed, and that they were the last warriors of his memory. There would be only one result to this war: a triumphant Imperium. The tragedy of this conflict would only come to light when the few surviving White Scars were interrogated for the location of their Primarch. The defenders believed themselves the final guardians of the Emperor's dream. The invading force to them were the traitors. As the truth was told, many refused to accept that their Primarch could have discarded them. Others wept as it struck chords within them, their souls telling them all they needed to know. Those left behind were the ones Jagatai had been unable to taint, those too noble and pure of spirit. For their virtues they had led their people into a massacre. A remembrancer of Abaddon's fleet penned the words for this most harrowing of events. Chogoris burnt to ashes, bloodied by war, though enemies, though foes. Only loyal sons of the Emperor died that day. During the ensuing Dornian Heresy, the Death Guard was not the only legion that had drawn the interest of the Lord of Decay, for the formerly noble Blood Angels Legion fell from grace and were eternally damned, becoming unwilling, cadaverous plague carriers. By the time the Heresy ended, the Blood Angels had already abandoned their former homeworld, the moon of Baal Secundus. Though the Blood Angels had already turned their back on the place, Abaddon's mass crusades against the homes of the Chaos Legions drew them inexorably there. By this point, the changes wrought by Nurgle were so advanced that even Mortarion of the Death Guard, brought up breathing the noxious chemicals smog of Barbarous, would not risk setting foot on the planet without his armor tightly sealed. The Loyalists found something approaching a demon world, inhabited only by the shambling warp entities of the Plague God. The Imperial forces withdrew to orbit and subjected Baal Secundus to a sustained atomic bombardment, which exceeded even that of its Great War in its ferocity. The thrice devastated moon was declared perdita and quarantined by the Imperium until it was swallowed by the ever-expanding borders of Ultramar Segmentum. As the Death Guard continued to prosecute their war of vengeance against the traitorous Imperial worlds that still remained loyal to Dorn and his cause, soon more of the other legions began to take notice in the inherent change in how the Death Guard legionnaires performed in battle. Gone was the old recklessness, violence, and disorganization. Now all their legionnaires fought as one solidified whole, almost uncanny in how they all marched in lockstep, fired their weapons in unison, and never flinching in the face of deadly enemy fire or overwhelming odds. Even in comparison to other Space Marine legionnaires, they were almost robot-like and noticeably, strangely quiet. But Mortarion was the same. Some would even say he was relieved. And any Legion officer would say that the Death Guard had just found itself and was transformed while trapped deep within the warp. With the help of the Thousand Suns, the Death Guard started to once again utilize Psykers within their ranks. The acceptance of Typhon gave way to many more brothers who had kept their innate psychic abilities hidden. And soon the Death Guard forged a formidable librarius of their own. Barbarous is a feral world which orbits near its dim yellow sun in the segmentum tempestus, which creates a thick, miasmic atmosphere of toxic chemicals. The most virulent of these gases rise through Barbarous's perpetual clouds towards the heat of its star, making the world beneath a dismal place of night, unbroken by starlight and with short, shadowy days. An atmosphere breathable by humans exists only in the highest elevations, while the lower areas of elevations such as flat moors and valley basins of the jagged, stony mountains which spine the world are covered in a thick, deadly, and cloying mist. Highly intelligent human nobles that reside in the mighty citadels in the mountain fastness are immune to the toxic soup of the planet's atmosphere. When humans first settled Barbarous, the horrific environmental conditions from which they had to eke out survival quickly reduced them to a pre-feudal state. The beliefs of the Death Guard echo those of their Primarch. At the heart of their core beliefs is the unshakable determination that mankind is weak and susceptible to corruption. Therefore, men needs guidance and leadership, but also a harsh hand when needed, like a shepherd with his flock. The battle for the future of mankind is one that can only be achieved through the endurance of any hardship, no matter how terrible. The liberation of humanity justifies the ultimate use of any means. The Death Guard's faith in inner strength, iron will, and unshakable resolution in the face of hardship has led to what some of their detractors believe to be is a culture of overweening pride, arrogance, and an utter contempt for those they deem inferior. Attrition rates within the Death Guard Legion on active service are frighteningly high despite their legendary resilience. Indeed, for many years of the Great Crusade, only the World Eaters and Iron Warriors were on occasion recorded to have spent more lives proportionately to their strength in pursuit of the Imperium's conquest. Barbarous itself, in a short span of years, became little more than a factory to produce new recruits for the Death Guard Legion. An intake from other sources of recruitment to which the Legion had title dwindled to a mere handful, unless the pressure of fatalities in the field proved too great. Mortarion's resistance to use of bloodstock other than that of Barbarous wavered only because of the need to keep his Legion's strength battle-worthy, according to his own high standards. Recruitment solely from Barbarous was, however, aided by the high suitability of the planet's feral population for the Astartes conversion process, and remains so to this day. Today's recruitment is coupled with the normal culling of people on Barbarous, the population is constantly thinned to prevent overpopulation. This is done through mandatory annual trials, where only the strongest, most durable and dedicated youths are chosen to join the ranks of the Death Guard. Should they manage to survive the 14th Legion's arduous trials, they will then begin the process of being transformed into a transhuman Astartes. In the modern era, the Death Guard still fight in the most brutal and unforgiving war zones imaginable. Should their numbers begin to fall dangerous low levels, after particularly bloody and grinding campaigns that have high attrition rates, they will often utilize the Lazarus protocols as a final countermeasure to stem their losses. The corpses of their fallen battle brothers are meticulously prepared and permanently sealed within their power armor. They are then preserved in cryostasis until such time that they are needed when battle calls. Through the powers of cybermancy, the dead are raised up and made to fight for the Emperor once again. Before they were reunited with their Primarch, the Dusk Raiders conformed very closely to the standard raiment of arms and organizational patterns laid out in the Principia Bellicosa for the early Space Marine legions by the Imperial Officio Militaris. At its most fundamental level, the Dusk Raiders Legion was organized around the principle of equipping its individual Space Marines as well as possible, so that they could endure and prevail against any foe encountered and operate for extended periods without resupply or support if necessary. This dogma was the cornerstone of the 14th Legion's way of war, and was built upon the foundations of independence and surety with which the Dusk Raiders had always fought. The Dusk Raiders are noted in the Imperial records of this period as maintaining a well-rounded capacity for unleashing multiple modes of warfare, although with some bias towards heavy assault formations and attritional engagements, as evidenced by the particular use of close-range weaponry within the Legion. The Dusk Raiders Legion relied upon its infantry to provide its strategic strength, with the bulk of tactical fire support coming from heavily armed support squads, and later with considerable numbers of Terminators and Dreadnoughts providing reinforcement and an assault spearhead where needed. Once Mortarion became the master of the 14th Legion, the Death Guard changed dramatically, including its arts of warfare. Mortarion was at his heart an infantryman, and his Death Guard, he saw the chance to perfect the principle of the utilitarian warrior on foot, who could go anywhere, fight on any ground, and destroy any enemy through resilience, resolve, and implacable aggression. As part of this doctrine, the Death Guard's squad formations were largely not static as in most Space Marine legions of the time, but were formed, reformed, and ordered as needed, and as the given tactical situation required. To this end, a Death Guard legionary was trained to be equally adept at any infantry role he might be called upon to perform on the battlefield rather than fighting at all times in a particular specialized role. In this way, a Death Guard Astartes would act as a tactical marine in one battle, a heavy weapons fire support specialist in another, and so on, with only tech marines and other highly specialized occupations remaining wholly dedicated to a single tactical one. The Death Guard was organized around the principles established by the Dusk Raiders and built upon the ways they had fought. Bolter, Melta, and Flamer became the Death Guard's trinity of weapons around which their warfare was based, keeping supply needs to a minimum. Other types of ranged weapons are deployed sparingly, only as the tactical situation or nature of the enemy demands. Each Death Guard also carries a close combat blade as well, which includes broad trench daggers, war scythes, and the heavy slashing Kukra native to Barbarous. Forged of dense black Karam steel, these brutal and efficient weapons soon became the hallmark of the legionnaires of the 14th Legion. This reliance on simple but effective tools of war is an outward manifestation of the cardinal belief held by the Legion that the Space Marine himself is the greatest of all weapons at the Imperium's disposal, a tireless engine of war before which any enemy will eventually succumb. The Death Guard, since the time of the Great Crusade, continues to rely almost exclusively on its infantry to provide its strategic strength, with the bulk of tactical support firepower coming from heavily armed support squads, and later from the Legion's considerable numbers of Terminators and Dreadnoughts, which provides reinforcement and assault spearheads where needed. This focus on heavy infantry formations is also one of the reasons the Death Guard Legion developed a particularly admirable record in fighting to clear space hulks of alien infestation and for their ability to destroy fortifications and citadels from within. While the Death Guard does utilize field armor, support vehicles and transports, these are not given any primacy in the Legion's tactical doctrine. The only exception to this are dedicated siege units such as the Vindicator, which is fielded in disproportionately high numbers by the Legion, alongside squadrons of Fellblade super heavy tanks and Land Raider Spartans in mass warfare. It would be notable in hindsight, and would prove to be a telling factor, that a proportionally high number of the Death Guard Legion's war machine crews were still of Terran blood by the time of the Dornian Heresy, while the heaviest infantry strike units, particularly the Legion's sizable core of Terminator armor-equipped shock troops, were of barbarous stock. Unlike some Space Marine legions whose operations were often diffused across separate commands, task forces and campaigns spread across the galaxy during the Great Crusade, the Death Guard were accustomed to fight as a single united force. As such, when the 14th Legion came to Istvan system at the start of the Heresy, with almost its entire strength, the most accurate accounts of the claim that the Death Guard maintained approximately 95,000 Space Marines, 70 capital ships, and perhaps 3 times that of number of smaller escort and assault crafts. With the conclusion of this bitter fighting on Istvan V, it is estimated Mortarian's Legion had been reduced by well over 55,000 casualties, counting the Death Guard's stubborn defense, betrayed to their deaths in the ashen wastes of Istvan V, and in lives spent by Mortarian sons in their futile efforts to rescue their brothers on the surface during the massive void battle in orbit above. It is believed that during the protracted fighting that was to occur during the Dropside Massacre, engagement suited the Death Guard Legion well, with a strong emphasis on preference on attritional warfare and close order infantry tactics. It is believed that during the fighting, the final nucleonic bombardment exacted a heavy toll on the Death Guard's armored divisions. When the 14th Legion was still known as the Dusk Raiders, its Astartes signature strategy had been to attack their foes at nightfall, thus earning them their Legion moniker. The Dusk Raiders' power armor was an unpainted slate gray in color, while their right arm and one or both shoulder plates were painted crimson. This was done with the intent to symbolically show their enemies what they truly were: the Emperor's red right hand. Relentless and unstoppable, many enemies would throw down their weapons the moment the sun dipped beneath the horizon, rather than dare to fight them. With the coming of Mortarion, the Legion's combat doctrines changed as the Death Guard became a single instrument of his will. The Death Guard came to believe that victory came through sheer relentlessness. Their weapons, while not ornate, functioned without flaw. They did not maneuver in fanciful patterns to confuse the enemy. Instead, they stood their ground and waited for the enemy assaults to falter before striking back with fatal force. Any environment or situation Mortarion had his advisors could not compensate for. The Death Guard would overcome through sheer stubborn resilience and painful endurance. Mortarion had learned the art of warfare on a world almost covered in mountainous terrain, and even though his innate intellect allowed him to grasp the proper use of tanks and armored vehicles, the primacy of the foot soldier remained the Death Guard's trademark. Each Space Marine was well trained in a variety of infantry disciplines and was able to function in almost any role or environment. The Death Guard are arguably the most remorseless and among the most feared of the Space Marine legions. This is not simply because of their power in battle or force of arms, but also because there seems to be no loss they will not accept to ensure eventual victory, and no hell they would not endure to reach their foe. Although specializing in entrenched and attritional warfare, the Legion also has a number of formations and tactics that enables it to operate in concentrated and crushing force in an attack. One was dubbed the Reaping by those who had fought alongside the Death Guard during the Great Crusade, a heavily reinforced column of attacks particularly suited to urban warfare. The Legionnaires of the Death Guard always reflect the gaunt, shadow eyes quality of their Primarch that gave the lie to the hardness with which they were made. The original Terran stock displayed a stoic temperament and gene-crafted aptitude, reminiscent of their genetic inheritance from the Ironside warriors of old Albia. With the introduction of the feral stock of pale, gaunt people of Barbarous, the Death Guard Legion's gene seed seemed to amplify the uncommonly resistance to contagion and toxins in its barbarous candidates to unheard of levels. As for their battle cry, the battle cry of the 14th Legion is Forterra and Mortarion. When they enter the fray, the 7th Great Company in particular uses the cry, "Count the 7!" Nurgle tried to bite off more than he could chew.